Alexander Cooper was no ordinary man. As one of Austin's most successful entrepreneurs, his name was synonymous with luxury and power. At just 38 years old, he had everything money could buy: cars, mansions, and a lifestyle that drew envy from even the most elite. But Alexander had one fatal flaw: his pride. At a high-profile gala held in the heart of Austin, his arrogance was put to the test. Amid the clinking of champagne glasses and whispered conversations, one of his old rivals, Ethan Calloway, decided to provoke him. "Alex," Ethan drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, "you're always talking about how you can conquer anything, no matter the stakes. But tell me this, could you handle a real challenge? Something money can't fix?" Alexander leaned back, a confident smirk tugging at his lips. "Name it," he said, his tone laced with a mix of boredom and intrigue. Ethan grinned, sensing an opportunity to humiliate his rival. "How about this? You marry someone completely outside your type, someone society would never expect you to choose. Let's say Isabella Martinez." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Isabella. She wasn't a part of their glamorous circle, but was known in passing, an intelligent, hard-working woman who managed the front office of a small law firm. She was sharp, witty, and unapologetically herself. However, in a world obsessed with appearances, Isabella's full-figured frame made her an easy target for cruel whispers and judgmental stares. Alexander chuckled, brushing off the comment at first. "Is that all? You think I'd lose a bet like that?" Ethan pressed on. "Here's the deal. You marry her, stay with her for at least a month, and here's the kicker, no loopholes. You actually have to treat her like a wife. No avoiding her, no cheating, no buying your way out. If you do it, I'll donate $1 million to the charity of your choice. Fail, and you owe the same to one of mine." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some were entertained by the audacity of the challenge. Others were appalled by the sheer insensitivity of turning someone's life into a wager. Alexander's smirk faded slightly as he considered the terms. It wasn't about the money. He could write a check for $1 million without blinking. No, this was about his reputation, his pride. Backing down would mean admitting there were limits to what he could do. "Done," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take the dare. But don't come crying to me when I prove you wrong." Ethan raised his glass in a mock toast. "Let's see if you're still this confident a month from now." But across town, Isabella had no idea her life was about to be turned upside down. For most of his life, Alexander Cooper had worn his confidence like armor. But beneath the tailored suits and expensive watches lay a history he rarely shared. Raised in the outskirts of Austin by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Alexander had learned early on that success wasn't given. It was taken. His mother, Maria, was his greatest inspiration, but also the source of a deep, unspoken wound. She had struggled with her weight for most of her life, and Alexander vividly remembered the way society treated her. Even as a child, he couldn't understand why people would laugh behind her back or make assumptions about her intelligence because of her appearance. But Maria never let the ridicule break her. "People's opinions don't define your worth, Alex," she would say, her voice steady but her eyes heavy with unspoken pain. Those words stuck with him, even as he grew older and distanced himself from the boy who once stood by his mother's side. By the time Alexander turned 21, he had built his first company from scratch, a tech startup that skyrocketed him to success almost overnight. With money came validation, and with validation came the power to control how others saw him. He vowed never to feel helpless or small, as his mother often had. However, the price of his relentless pursuit of success was steep. Relationships felt transactional. Friendships were built on mutual gain, and love was a concept he dismissed as a luxury he couldn't afford. Over time, he buried the softer, empathetic side of himself, replacing it with a man who saw people as challenges to conquer or tools to use. When Ethan issued his dare, Alexander's initial reaction wasn't rooted in malice toward Isabella. In truth, he barely knew her, but the proposition stung in a way he hadn't expected. It was as though Ethan had found a chink in his armor, calling out the boy who still cared about what people thought. Accepting the dare wasn't about the money or even winning. It was about proving something to himself, proving he could control any narrative, overcome any situation, and emerge unscathed. Yet, as he prepared to meet Isabella, an unsettling thought gnawed at the back of his mind. What if this wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be? Isabella Martinez was not the kind of woman who sought attention, yet life had a way of thrusting her into the spotlight, usually in ways she didn't want. At 36 years old, she had grown used to the judgmental stares and whispers that followed her wherever she went. But she didn't let it define her. Born and raised in Austin, Isabella's life had been a study in resilience. Her father had left when she was just a child, leaving her mother, Rosa, to raise her and her younger brother, Mateo, on a single income. Rosa worked tirelessly as a nurse, instilling in Isabella a sense of compassion and a fierce determination to rise above her circumstances. Isabella excelled academically, earning a scholarship to a local college. Her dream had always been to become a lawyer, but life had other plans. When Rosa fell ill during Isabella's junior year, she dropped out to care for her mother and take on extra jobs to support Mateo's education. Though it was a sacrifice, Isabella never regretted it. Now, she worked as a receptionist at a small law firm, a job that paid the bills but left her feeling unfulfilled. Still, she carried herself with grace, her sharp wit and warm demeanor earning the respect of her colleagues. Her weight, however, was a constant source of unsolicited advice and criticism from strangers and even those close to her. "You'd be so much prettier if you lost a few pounds," her aunt would say at every family gathering, as if Isabella hadn't heard it 1,000 times before. But Isabella wasn't one to wallow in self-pity. She had a dry sense of humor and a quick mind that made her the go-to person for problem-solving at work. Beneath her thick skin, though, she longed for more, a life where she wasn't defined by her appearance, a career that fulfilled her, and maybe, just maybe, someone who saw her for who she truly was. So when Alexander Cooper showed up at her office one sunny afternoon, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary, Isabella's first instinct was suspicion. Men like him didn't just walk into her world without a reason. "Isabella Martinez?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. "That depends," she replied, her tone guarded. "Who's asking?" Alexander extended a hand, his trademark charm on full display. "Alexander Cooper. I'd like to discuss something unusual." Unusual didn't even begin to cover it. As Alexander laid out the terms of his proposal, marriage, a financial agreement, and the promise of a substantial donation to a charity of her choice, Isabella felt a mix of disbelief and anger. "You want me to marry you as part of some kind of bet?" she asked, her voice sharp. Alexander didn't flinch. "I know how it sounds, but it's more than that. Think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement." Her first instinct was to throw him out, but as she thought about the money he was offering, enough to finally pay off her mother's medical debts and secure Mateo's future, she hesitated. Could she swallow her pride for the sake of her family? "Give me a day," she said finally, her heart pounding. As Alexander left the office, Isabella leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She wasn't a fool. She knew this wasn't about her. It was about his ego, his pride. But part of her wondered, could she use the situation to her advantage? And what would it cost her if she did? The day Isabella agreed to meet Alexander in person to discuss the arrangement felt surreal. They chose a neutral spot, a cozy, unassuming cafe tucked away from Austin's bustling city streets. Isabella, dressed in a simple floral blouse and black slacks, clutched her tote bag tightly as she walked in. Her heart raced, not with anticipation, but with unease. Alexander, already seated at a corner table, looked as polished as ever. His navy suit was impeccable, his watch gleaming under the soft light. He stood when she approached, offering a polite but distant smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out her chair. Isabella hesitated for a moment before sitting down. "Let's get something straight," she began, her voice steady. "I'm not here because I'm flattered or intrigued. I'm here because I have people depending on me. Don't mistake this for anything else." Alexander raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Fair enough. I respect that. And let me be clear, I'm not looking for anything romantic. This is the partnership, nothing more." His bluntness stung more than Isabella wanted to admit, but she nodded. "Good. As long as we're on the same page." The conversation that followed was surprisingly civil. Alexander explained the terms of their arrangement in meticulous detail, laying out everything from financial compensation to how they would navigate public appearances. Isabella, ever practical, asked pointed questions, making it clear she wouldn't be steamrolled. But as the minutes turned into an hour, something unexpected happened. Beneath Alexander's polished exterior, Isabella caught glimpses of something more, a flicker of vulnerability when he mentioned his late mother, a trace of humor when the waitress accidentally spilled coffee near his phone. And Alexander, for his part, found himself intrigued by Isabella's sharp wit and unyielding honesty. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor did she fawn over his wealth. In fact, she seemed wholly unimpressed, which was a rarity in his world. When the meeting ended, Alexander extended his hand once more. "So, do we have a deal?" Isabella hesitated, her gaze meeting his. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "But on one condition. You treat me with respect. No games, no condescension. If you can't do that, this is over before it starts." Alexander nodded, surprised by the edge in her tone. "You have my word." As they walked out of the cafe, both felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. For Isabella, the decision felt like stepping onto a tightrope over a chasm. For Alexander, it was the first time in years he felt uncertain about what he was walking into. The transformation began not with grand gestures, but with small moments. The next day, Alexander sent Isabella a handwritten note thanking her for trusting him, accompanied by a bouquet of sunflowers, not roses, which he assumed she might find cliché. Isabella, though initially skeptical, found herself smiling at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as unbearable as she feared. But both were unaware that the real transformation wasn't about their public personas or the success of their arrangement. It was about the cracks forming in their own walls, the barriers they had each built to protect themselves from a world that had often been cruel. What started as a business deal was already shifting into something neither of them could have predicted. The first week of their arrangement was anything but smooth. As news of Alexander Cooper's sudden, unexpected marriage to Isabella Martinez spread, the world of high society erupted in whispers, speculation, and judgment. "Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" asked an article in a local gossip column. Social media buzzed with cruel commentary, with many dissecting Isabella's appearance, questioning her motives, and ridiculing Alexander's decision. Alexander, who had always brushed off criticism like lint on his bespoke suits, found himself unusually affected. For the first time, the ridicule wasn't directed solely at him. It was aimed at Isabella. Seeing her name dragged through the mud awakened something unfamiliar in him: guilt. At the same time, Isabella faced her own battles. Walking into work the morning after the announcement felt like stepping onto a stage with glaring spotlights. Her colleagues, some polite, others blatantly rude, bombarded her with questions. "Is it true?" one asked, wide-eyed. "I didn't know you two were even dating," another said, her tone laced with skepticism. Isabella, always composed, simply smiled. "Some things are private," she replied, keeping her answers vague. But inside, she felt exposed, as if the world had suddenly gained access to her most personal vulnerabilities. At home, things were no easier. Though Alexander had insisted she move into a sprawling modern mansion to make the arrangement appear authentic, the vast, cold space only amplified their differences. Their interactions were polite but distant. They ate dinner at the same table, but the silence often felt oppressive. When Alexander would retreat to his office for hours, Isabella would find solace in reading or exploring the house's art collection. One evening, as she lingered in front of a painting, a serene landscape with soft golden hues, Alexander surprised her by speaking. "That was my mother's favorite," he said from the doorway, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. Isabella turned, startled. "It's beautiful," she replied. She had good taste. For a moment, Alexander seemed as if he might say more, but he merely nodded and walked away. It was a small moment, but it lingered with Isabella, hinting at layers to him she hadn't yet uncovered. Externally, the pressure was mounting. The couple's first public appearance at a charity gala was met with a mix of curiosity and scorn. Photographers swarmed as they stepped onto the red carpet. Alexander, ever the performer, placed a protective hand on Isabella's lower back, guiding her with confidence. But Isabella could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the whispers. Her chest tightened as she fought the urge to flee. "You're doing fine," Alexander murmured under his breath, his voice steady and low. She nodded, grateful for the reassurance, but the experience left her shaken. Later that night, as they returned home, Isabella finally confronted him. "This isn't just a game for me," she said, her voice trembling. "Every look, every comment, it's personal, and I'm the one carrying most of it." Alexander, uncharacteristically, didn't argue. Instead, he looked at her with something akin to regret. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't think about how this would affect you. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. It was the first crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between them began to shift. Small gestures, a cup of tea left on the counter for Isabella, a note she left by his computer thanking him for his apology, hinted at a growing understanding. But beneath the surface, both were grappling with their own insecurities. Alexander, for all his confidence, couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated Isabella. She was stronger, sharper, and far more resilient than he had expected, and that unnerved him. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself questioning her own emotions. Why did she care so much about what Alexander thought of her? And why did his small acts of kindness matter so much? Neither of them was ready to admit it. But their arrangement was becoming far more complicated than either had anticipated. By the third week, the tension that had once defined Alexander and Isabella's relationship began to dissolve, replaced by an unexpected sense of familiarity. They still walked on a delicate balance, but the cracks in their walls had widened, allowing fleeting moments of connection to shine through. One such moment came on a rare rainy afternoon in Austin. The storm had knocked out the power in Alexander's mansion, leaving them with little to do but wait for the generator to kick in. "What's the last book you read?" Isabella asked, breaking the silence as they sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room. Alexander glanced up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "Does an audiobook count?" Isabella chuckled, shaking her head. "Not really, but I'll let it slide if it was something good." He hesitated before answering. "The Art of War by Sun Tzu. I guess it's more of a business manual than a book." Isabella rolled her eyes. Of course. Let me guess. You're applying it to corporate takeovers. Alexander smirked. Something like that. What about you? Pride and Prejudice. She replied without missing a beat. His brow furrowed. The one with Mr. Darcy, right? What's so great about that story? It's not just about Mr. Darcy, Isabella said, her tone defensive. It's about understanding that people are more than their first impressions. You should try reading it sometime. Maybe I will, he replied, surprising even himself. The conversation drifted into lighter topics, and for the first time, they laughed together. Isabella found herself startled by how easy it was to talk to him when he wasn't trying so hard to be perfect. And Alexander, in turn, realized how much he enjoyed seeing Isabella's unfiltered personality, her wit, her passion, her unapologetic honesty. Later that week, another surprising moment unfolded. Alexander's company was hosting a charity auction, and Isabella had reluctantly agreed to attend. She wore a deep green dress that hugged her curves, her hair pinned up elegantly. As she descended the staircase, Alexander, standing near the door in his tailored tuxedo, paused mid-sentence while speaking with his assistant. You look incredible, he said, his voice unusually soft. Isabella, unused to such compliments, felt her cheeks warm. Thank you, she replied, brushing off the comment. But the way his gaze lingered made her heart race. The event itself was a whirlwind. Alexander expertly worked the room, introducing Isabella to his associates with ease. At first, she felt out of place, her nerves heightened by the judgmental glances cast her way. But as the evening wore on, she found herself loosening up, thanks in part to Alexander's subtle but steady presence at her side. When a particularly condescending woman made a snide remark about Isabella's weight, Alexander's reaction stunned her. Funny, he said, his tone cold and cutting, how people with nothing of substance to say resort to cheap insults. The woman turned bright red, stammering an apology before retreating. Isabella stared at Alexander, her emotions a mix of gratitude and disbelief. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly as they stepped away from the crowd. Yes, I did, he replied. No one has the right to talk to you like that. That night, as they drove home, the air between them felt different. There was an unspoken shift, an acknowledgement that their connection was becoming more than just transactional. But with the growing closeness came new fears. Alexander wrestled with the vulnerability creeping into his carefully constructed life. For so long, he had kept people at arm's length, and yet here was Isabella, steadily breaking through. Isabella, meanwhile, grappled with the possibility that she was letting herself care too much. She had agreed to this arrangement with the expectation of keeping her emotions in check, but Alexander's unexpected kindness and glimpses of sincerity made that harder by the day. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew whatever was happening between them was no longer just an arrangement. It was real, and that terrified them both. The growing connection between Alexander and Isabella was undeniable, but as their bond deepened, the weight of their past began to press against them, threatening to unravel everything. For Alexander, it started with an unexpected phone call from his estranged father, Gregory Cooper. The man who had walked out on his family when Alexander was 12 suddenly wanted a meeting. Gregory's voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, as he explained that he was in Austin for business and thought it was time they talked. Why now? Alexander asked, his voice cold. Because it's been long enough, Gregory replied. And because I heard you got married. I'd like to meet her. The call left Alexander shaken. He had spent years bearing the pain of his father's abandonment, convincing himself that the man's opinion didn't matter. But the mere mention of Gregory stirred old wounds, ones he wasn't ready to face. Isabella noticed a change in Alexander immediately. He became distant, spending late nights in his office and avoiding personal conversations. At first, She chalked it up to stress, but when she found him staring blankly at a photo of his mother one evening, she decided to confront him. "Something's bothering you," she said, standing in the doorway. "You can talk to me, you know." Alexander hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's nothing," he replied, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. Isabella walked over, her expression soft but firm. "You don't have to pretend with me, Alexander. Whatever it is, I'm here." For a moment, he considered brushing her off, but the sincerity in her eyes made him pause. With a deep breath, he told her about the call. "My father wants to meet," he said, his voice low. "After all these years, he just decides it's time. Like it's that simple." Isabella listened quietly, her heart aching for him. She had her own complicated history with absent family members, and she knew how deeply those wounds could cut. "What are you going to do?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. But another part, a part one hate to admit exists, wants answers." Isabella placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of quiet support. "Whatever you decide, just remember, you don't owe him anything. But if facing him helps you find peace, then it's worth considering." Her words stayed with Alexander, and after several sleepless nights, he agreed to meet Gregory at a small restaurant downtown. Isabella offered to go with him, but he insisted on handling it alone. The meeting was tense from the start. Gregory, now older and visibly weathered, greeted Alexander with a smile that felt hollow. "You've grown into a fine man," Gregory said, his tone attempting warmth. Alexander didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "What do you want, Gregory?" Gregory sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I deserve that. But honestly, I just want to make things right. I made mistakes, terrible ones, and I've regretted them every day since." Alexander's anger flared. "Regretted them? You didn't even call when Mom died. You didn't check on me. Didn't care how I was doing. And now, because it's convenient for you, you want forgiveness." Gregory's face fell, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely remorseful. "You're right," he admitted. "I failed you, but I'm trying to fix that now, even if it's too late." Alexander left the meeting with more questions than answers, his emotions in turmoil. When he returned home, Isabella was waiting for him in the living room. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Alexander shook his head, collapsing onto the couch beside her. "It was a mess. I don't know what to feel, anger, sadness, both." Isabella reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said. "But you faced him. That's something to be proud of." Meanwhile, Isabella was dealing with her own ghosts. A letter from her younger brother, Matteo, arrived unexpectedly, reopening a rift between them. Matteo had cut ties with her years ago, blaming her for decisions she had made after their mother's death. "I need to talk to you," the letter read. "There are things I didn't say back then that I need to say now. Can we meet?" The parallel struggles between Alexander and Isabella created an unspoken bond between them. They were both learning that the past could be both a prison and a teacher, and that confronting it was the only way to move forward. In the quiet moments they shared, their connection deepened, not through grand gestures, but through their willingness to stand by each other as they faced their respective demons. As time passed, Alexander and Isabella's relationship continued to evolve in ways neither of them had anticipated. What began as a pragmatic arrangement was now a complicated web of emotions, unspoken desires, and the looming question: what was real between them? One evening, as the sun set over Austin, casting a golden glow over the city's skyline, Isabella sat by the large window in Alexander's mansion, contemplating her next move. She had spent weeks wrestling with her emotions, trying to ignore the growing connection she felt toward him, but it had become impossible to deny. She had kept her distance, telling herself that this arrangement was temporary, that eventually Alexander would revert to his old ways, treating her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she found herself asking questions she hadn't even considered before. Was it possible to love someone you hadn't expected to care for? Meanwhile, Alexander was struggling with his own internal battle. Despite the growing attraction he felt for Isabella, he refused to let himself admit it. His pride, his past, and the deep-rooted fear of vulnerability kept him from acknowledging what was right in front of him. He had always been a man of control, and Isabella's unpredictable presence in his life was beginning to unravel that control in ways he couldn't ignore. The small moments of intimacy, when she laughed at one of his jokes, or when she quietly supported him during his darkest moments, had begun to chip away at the walls he had spent years building around his heart. But he refused to let her in completely. After all, what would that mean for the image he had spent his whole life creating? As they sat in the living room one evening, Alexander leaned back on the couch, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers in the shadows. Isabella sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap, trying to gauge his mood. She could feel the tension between them thickening, like a storm that was about to break. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, breaking the silence, "about everything." Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "About us," Isabella continued. "About this arrangement. About how things have changed." He leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Change how?" She hesitated, the words caught in her throat. "I think you know what I mean," she said quietly. We've been pretending that this is just a contract, that we're just two people playing a role. But it's not like that anymore, is it?" For a moment, Alexander didn't say anything, his gaze locked with hers, his expression softening for the first time in a long while. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What do you want from me, Isabella?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to be pulled. She didn't know how to answer it, because she didn't even know what she wanted anymore. But what she did know, with every fiber of her being, was that the man sitting across from her wasn't the same person he had been when this all began. "I want honesty," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I want to know if what we have is real. I need to know if I'm just someone you can tolerate until you find someone else. Or if you actually care about me." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander closed his eyes, his face tight with frustration. He had never been the type to let his emotions take over. But Isabella had cracked open something inside of him that he didn't know how to handle. "Isabella," he began, his voice strained. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in. I've spent my whole life keeping people out, keeping my distance. But the truth is," he paused, the words hanging in the air, "the truth is, I care about you more than I should." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. The rawness in his voice, the vulnerability that he rarely showed, left her speechless. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would either shatter everything or bring them closer. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang, interrupting the fragile moment between them. Alexander stood up abruptly, his expression hardening again, as if he was trying to regain his composure. "I'll get it," he muttered, walking toward the door with the same cold, distant air he had always carried. Isabella watched him, her mind racing. Was it too late? Had he just said what she wanted to hear because of the moment, or was there something more behind it? As Alexander opened the door, his face went pale. Standing there, looking every bit as imposing as Alexander remembered, was his father, Gregory Cooper. "I knew you'd be here," Gregory said, his voice dripping with a mixture of arrogance and a faint trace of guilt. "I've come to talk." Isabella's eyes darted between Alexander and the man standing at the doorway. She could sense the tension in the room, the weight of unresolved emotions hanging over them both. But before Alexander could respond, a realization hit him hard. It wasn't just the past that had been holding him back. It was his refusal to accept what was right in front of him. And now, with Gregory standing in the doorway, it was clear that the past would always be a shadow over their lives unless they both decided to confront it together. "I don't have time for this," Alexander said, his voice suddenly strong. "But I'll talk to you later. Right now, though." He turned to Isabella, his eyes filled with a silent plea. "We need to talk." For the first time, Isabella saw the real Alexander Cooper, the man willing to face his fears, willing to break free from the past, and finally willing to take a chance on what could be something real.